week, the UN holds a special General Assembly session on drugs. Have you heard of it? No, probably because it isn't actually going to change anything. And the only leaders attending will be those of Latin American countries who are actually the most desperate for something to change. We're at a kind of strange place in the world right now on drugs. Some countries, like Iran and Indonesia, execute drug users and dealers. Most of Europe, well, treat drugs as illegal but take a soft approach to soft drugs. Then there are some states in the US, plus Uruguay and soon Canada, which have legal regulated markets for cannabis. It is basically all over the place. But one of the staunchest supporters of a new approach is the former Deputy Prime Minister here, Nick Clegg, who famously argued with Theresa May over the issue while he was in government. Now, he's been to Colombia, one of the countries which called for this special UN summit, to meet President Santos, and while there, he made a report for us.
I'm visiting Colombia because it's a country that we can learn from. It's a place that knows better than anywhere else how organised crime controls the drug trade. And I'm going to talk to its president to discuss whether regulating and legalising drugs is a better way forward.
Okay, do you want to put it in?
Nick, go to the other side, please. You okay, guys?
Yeah.
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is your first time in Medellin, right?
First time Medellin, yeah.
Medellin was where the original narco-traffickers operated with such ruthless efficiency. It was home to the infamous Pablo Escobar, who controlled a vast criminal network that extended across Colombia and reached into many other countries. At one point, he was the 6th richest man in the world and supplied 80% of America's cocaine.
Hola, encantado. No, lo siento, el domingo. Muy bien.
The new mayor of Medellin has only just been elected, but he remembers the days of Escobar's rule.
Años más antes de la muerte de Pablo Escobar. Nosotros llegamos a tener 381 homicidios por cada 100.000 habitantes.
¿Cuántos?
381 homicidios.
¿Para cuántos? Para cada...
Por cada 100.000 habitantes. O sea, nosotros en un año, nadie ha vivido eso. La corrupción,
el Estado,
el dinero del narcotráfico, cómo fue penetrando todas las esferas de la sociedad, las instituciones.
Now Pablo Escobar is dead. His sister, Luz Maria Escobar, still lives in Medellin, but in a humble way she tries to keep a low profile. It's no longer good to have the name Escobar.
Siempre he tenido en las noches una oración por ellos. Ojalá la vida me diera la oportunidad de poder ayudar en muchas cosas. No solamente a Colombia, al mundo entero. Corte, por favor. Préstame los clines, luces.
But Luz Maria thinks the death of her brother didn't lead to the end of the problem.
Desafortunadamente, tristemente, el flagelo del narcotráfico sigue en nuestro país.
Está mejor ahora.
Pues sí, o sea, narcotráfico hay en Colombia y en todo el mundo, porque ya es un flagelo universal, que desafortunadamente no se ha podido arraigar, quitar.
There is still crime in Colombia and its link to drugs remains strong. The Colombian government has tried to address many of the security issues. They were helped by $16 billion of US support. And they also believe that cocaine and its use could be eradicated by aerial spraying huge swathes of the coca plant that is needed to make the drug. It didn't work. Colombia remains the #1 producer of cocaine in the world, and with it, the crime gangs persist.
Hola. Soy Nick Clegg. Hola.
Fabiola is a coca farmer. She just wants to grow coca, but not for cocaine.
Entonces es la hoja de coca, ¿no?
Sí. Esto no es desde antes de Cristo está la hoja de coca. Entonces,
producing coca from the days before Christ.
Hay plantas dulces, hay plantas amargas y hay plantas medias. neutrales. Entonces ella está presente para los escenarios espirituales de todas las formas.
The aerial spraying was finally halted in October last year, but this method in the war on drugs had already proved destructive to many ordinary Colombians.
Los químicos que van a llevar a hacer a la producción de... Si usted mira cuáles son...
No es la planta misma.
No es la planta misma, son otros componentes que traen para ponerle ahí. ¿Y quién estuvo fumigando en el Plan Colombia? Nuestra capa vegetal hoy en Colombia devastada, vuelta a nada, con una capa social también destruida.
I think he's here. I'd like to go and see him.
I had breakfast with Cesar Gaviria, who was Colombia's president in the 1990s at the height of the narco-traffickers' powers. He survived many assassination attempts and some of his family members were murdered. But it was under his watch that Pablo Escobar was killed, and he had some interesting ideas about drugs.
Colombia is not a security problem. I mean, we have improved dramatically. But even with that, security in cities, no homicides, but security, is still a huge problem. And the reason for that is local consumption of drugs, not international trafficking, but local consumption.
So
that is totally well documented.
Right. So your view is if you decriminalise that then helps the security issue in the cities?
Yeah. You have to,
of course.
If these people, these people that commit these petty crimes, always do it to buy drugs.
In fact, Colombia has gone further than the UK towards decriminalising drugs, a lesson we could learn from. In the UK, many people are forced to steal to fund their drug habit because both drug dealing and drug use are illegal. In Colombia, possession of small amounts is legal.
Hola, Julián.
I was fascinated to visit a government-funded clinic that actually tests people's drugs to prove they don't contain dangerous chemicals.
Nosotros salimos a los bares, nosotros salimos a los festivales. Hace 15 días tuvimos un festival underground de unas 3.500 personas donde analizamos. Bueno, de eso se trata.
¿Puede rápidamente mostrarme cómo?
Sí, claro, mira, esto es como un pequeño museo que tenemos de sustancias. Muchas personas no han tenido nunca un contacto con las sustancias. Esto es marihuana, esto es bazuco, lo que llamamos como el hijo calavera del... Y bueno, ya si quieres conocer como el programa de análisis.
Yo le tomo la muestra, le tomo un par de datos básicos y se lo paso al químico y él ahí hace el análisis y le da resultados. Es confidencial, totalmente anónimo, dura 5 minutos el análisis y no tiene ningún valor. Entonces, yo le recibo la muestra.
Después del análisis veis que hay un problema.
Se saca una alerta.
¿Una alerta a quién?
Por las redes sociales, por varios medios.
No comprar ahí.
Exacto.
Bueno,
entonces ya
ver,
aquí se lo paso acá al químico.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Buena suerte con todo, Chao, muchas gracias, Cuidado,
No me lo vaya a comer. Muchas gracias.
With Colombia now making progress in undermining the cartels, Medellin is now a different place. It was recently voted one of the best cities to live in Latin America. So it really is a fantastic illustration of how, even in a very, very poor part of Latin America, things can change. And the grip, the terrible, deadly grip of kind of narco-trafficking and narco-criminality does eventually end.
Nick Clegg there, ably helped, by the way, by BBC producer Rachel Wright. And Mr Clegg is with me here. And we're joined from New York by Kevin Sabet, former drugs policy advisor to the Obama administration. Nick Clegg, thanks for making the film. Very interesting. Just what would your policy be? Not on cannabis. We know the Lib Dems have had a decriminalisation policy on that for ages. But cocaine, crack, crystal meth, what would be your view?
I think cannabis, though, is the big, that's by far the
but
biggest
that's the
drug.
easy one. Let's talk about
I don't think it's
cocaine.
easy at all.
Well, let's talk about cocaine, because you've just made a film in Colombia where they supply the world's
if you
cocaine.
speak to the president of, you cut the bit where I spoke to the president of that very country, and he says if you want to make if you really want to shift the world's approach to the war on drugs, which has clearly failed because the criminals are getting richer, the potency and the harm of the drugs are getting stronger. You've got to start with cannabis.
Now, I understand that. What would be your policy on cocaine?
Well, for me, the focus is on cannabis, because I think that is by far the biggest share. It's the lion's share of the profits of the criminal gangs. It's where other parts of the world are experimenting by regulating it, taking the sale, and in the interaction.
So you don't have a policy on cocaine or crystal meth or all these other drugs?
Well, of course you have you want to reduce. Look, the whole.
But you don't have your policy is the same as the UN policy, which is the same as the war on drugs that everybody's been fighting everywhere.
I think everybody's policy. You're right. There is one point of consensus, which is everybody wants to reduce the harm of drugs. I'm a dad. I don't want my kids taking drugs.
I know, but I'm just asking. You've got a different policy to the world on cannabis, but the same policy on cocaine.
So, because cannabis is by far the biggest drug that is consumed, given that that is the great thing which fuels the bank accounts of the criminal community around the world, you've got to deal with that and that above and beyond everything else. Of course, that means you also give treatment to people who have addictions of other varieties of other drugs, but the cannabis question is the question which the world faces right now.
Right. Kevin Sabet, do you agree with that? Do you draw a distinction between cannabis, which you might have one policy to, and cocaine and harder drugs where you take a different policy?
Well, obviously they're different, but I must correct one thing. The vast majority of the revenues coming into transnational criminal groups and these drug trafficking organizations is not from cannabis at all. Cannabis is the vast majority of illegal drug use is cannabis, but these are violent criminal organizations getting their money from human trafficking mainly, and then we're talking about things like extortion, kidnapping, cocaine, methamphetamine, and heroin. And so that is why there is absolutely no real, you cannot take it seriously to say that we're going to be legalizing cocaine and methamphetamine, especially in parts of the world where institutions are weak. Now, I will say on the cannabis policy that Mr. Clegg and his colleagues and others have forwarded for legalization, I mean, I find that to be very disappointing given the incredibly progressive and congratulatory policy we should give the Lib Dems on mental health. But the issue is mental health is absolutely connected, especially to heavy, high-potent cannabis use. You cannot have one strategy policy for mental illness and mental health and then turn around and say Colorado and Washington may be having it right. Because I can tell you from the U.S., the increases in youth use and in the problems that are coming out of this massive commercial industry, it is the global tobacco industry all over again. We don't want to be copying alcohol and tobacco for cannabis.
Answer that specific point, if you would, Nick Clegg. It is an interesting one, isn't it? Because there are links between mental health damage and cannabis use, which you want to legalise. And I suspect under your policy...
So I think the very worst people to help either your mental health or your cannabis consumption or any other health problems you have is the criminal fraternity around the world. Why on earth are we allowing these damaging substances to be held in the hands of people who wish us ill? Criminals. Surely it is better to bring this out into the open, to regulate it, that you can make sure that what people consume is safer for them. You can tax it, you can restrict it by age, you can make sure that you can go after the criminals who are at the moment are getting away scot-free. The extraordinary thing at the moment under the present arrangements is we're locking up people because of possession of drugs, and we're allowing the criminals who sell them the drugs to get away scot-free.
Kevin Sabet, come in.
Sure. Well, first of all, that is a complete false dichotomy that we have to lock people up in prison or we have to essentially allow it to go to Philip Morris and the global alcohol industry, which obviously in the UK has been a complete public health disaster. The issue is you do not have to go to either criminalizing and throwing people in prison. I don't think you should do that for people who are using any drugs. I think they absolutely need treatment, but we don't want to increase the availability, promotion, and commercialization that would absolutely come with this idea of legalization. So, let's not get caught in that trap. In fact, the UK has made progress on this with drugs courts, with a special individual courts that deal with this very complex connection between crime and addiction. Because a lot of people are committing crime to either fuel their drug habit, which they're going to do anyway, whether it's legal or not, or under the influence of drugs, which they're going to do more if it's legal. So you have to look at this in a much more nuanced way.
Kevin Sabet, thank you very much. And Kevin, I'm going to let you go now. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for having me.
Nick Clegg, interesting set of discussions there. While we've got you, I wonder if we can talk to you about John Whittingdale just very briefly and what you make of I mean, Andrew Mitchell telling us earlier, nothing to see at all, move along. What do you make of the change in policy that's occurred under John Whittingdale as Culture Secretary to the press? Because there was a different policy under the last government, wasn't there?
Look, as it happens, I don't care at all about what John Whittingdale gets up into his private life. It's his private life, and right. As you imply in your question, I think the reason any of this has any resonance, which, by the way, I suspect it would even if it was a different Secretary of State, or whether he did or didn't have a relationship with this particular individual, is that this Conservative government, and it's the most open secret in Westminster, is desperately trying to wriggle out of actually delivering on the commitments that David Cameron and the Conservative Party made with all other parties in the last Parliament following the recommendations of the Leveson process. And, you know, very solemn promises were made by the Conservative Party to the McCanns. Exactly. An Act of Parliament was passed on a cross-party basis. Actually, the Royal Charter approach was a Conservative invention. And now, for reasons you'll need to ask the Conservative Party about, they're terribly keen not to offend some of the newspapers who don't like that whole process for, in my view, rather misplaced reasons. But that is the point.
That's
which I think
we should be looking at rather than photos of John Whittingdale.
His personal life is his personal life.
But do you think there's a potential? Because some have said, well, isn't there a conflict of interest? Because he is responsible for determining policy on regulating the press, and he might be wanting to court favour with the press. Do you think there is a conflict there that would worry you at all?
Look, knowing how government works, actually, at the end of the day, this issue of whether you implement Leveson in full or not, as everyone promised they would, falls on David Cameron's desk. And it was, as it happens, David Cameron, not John Whittingdale, who made very clear promises to the country, to Parliament, to the victims of the hacking, to the McCanns and so on, that it would be implemented in full. That is what this government is now choosing not to do.
Which suggests it's not a John Whittingdale conflict of interest, because it's the Prime Minister who decides it anyway.
Exactly. I personally think this issue would be there whether John Whittingdale was the Secretary of State or not.
Nick Clegg, thank you very much. Thanks. Now, if you ever flirted, however fleetingly, with the idea that radio was a fading medium, you would surely have discarded that thought in light of the current attention being lavished on the Archers. The oldest soap has been absorbing users of the newest social media. Two words explain why: Helen and Rob. A slowly developed plotline of a bullying husband and a sensitive wife that develops into violence.
Rob and I are together. An item, a couple. I love him. He loves me, and it's over with him and Jess. And as soon as possible, Henry and I are going to be moving in with him. So now you know.
So, tell me.
Oh, Rob.
I just want to understand.
I know, it looks a bit funny.
It's a bit more than funny, Helen. Let's get this straight. You planned an afternoon out with Henry.
On the Blackberry line, he'd have loved it.
An afternoon out on a steam train with Henry.
Yes.
And with Kirsty.
Yes.
Behind my back.
Well,
Deceiving me.
No, don't say that.
Lying to me about it, and lying to the school as well.
Rob, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
You really want to leave?
Rob, let go!
All right. I'll show you. You want to know how you can leave?
Rob.
You see this knife? Take it. Come on, put it in your hand. Do what Greg did. End it all now. Go on, I dare you. Because you're nothing without me, Helen. Nothing.
Well, a little spoiler alert. At one point, you were led to think Helen had killed Rob, but tonight we learned that Rob has not only survived, he's pulling through after an infection. She will be charged with attempted murder. How will the plot end? Don't ask Louisa Patikas, who plays Helen, or Sean O'Connor, the editor of The Archers, who are here and are not going to give anything away. Sean, how long ago did you know this plotline was going to come to this?
About 3 years ago, when I first accepted the job, and in fact I went to Vanessa Whitburn's house, who formerly ran The Archers, and pitched the idea to her, and she said, it's a great story, you must do it. And the next day I rang one of the writers and talked about how we might make a tricky relationship between Helen and Rob that wasn't very romantic. And then we found out about this syndrome called gaslighting, which is based on the play, which is effectively coercive control. So that's how it started, really, about 3 years ago.
And you'd written a book, actually, in your previous life, about a handsome murderer, basically.
Yeah, about it's very Rob Titchener. It's about a guy who was an ex-RAF pilot in the Second World War, who was very charming, very charismatic, public school, Oxbridge, who ended up killing 2 women in 1946, a guy called Neville Heath. And it's a fable in some way about not believing in the surface. And actually what's happened in Ambridge is that they all buy into Rob and his charming hunting, shooting, fishing behaviour, when in fact he seems to be at the beginning of the story a sort of a tall, dark, handsome man, but in fact he's rather sinister beneath.
And it's called Handsome Bruce, I should say, not
yes.
Handsome. And so, Louisa, when did you get let into what is about to happen to you? Was that 3 years ago? Or
Well, it was slightly drip-fed to me as well. I had an idea of what might be going on, but it was much more sort of true for us because we just knew a month in advance, pretty much.
Right.
So we're slightly ahead of the audience in knowing what's going on.
But your character, I mean, has changed quite a bit. I mean, it is quite an evolution, really, as the confidence has been taken away and you've become more neurotic and more kind of... It's just a really interesting development. I mean, it's presumably been the most interesting thing you've done with the part in the 16 years you've been there.
She's had a few exciting storylines, but, I mean, yes, you're right. It's a dream for any actor to work with this kind of material, and the sort of slow burn and the highly dramatic peaks, incredibly conceived, written, paced. And, yeah, I'm incredibly lucky.
I mean, here's a theory about why the attention is so focused on it and what makes good soap. It's that you've really been very patient. I mean, you've just... Goodness, Sean, 3 years is quite a long time to be planning it. It's not like it's getting boring, let's have a domestic violence thing.
It's about 900 episodes, actually, which is a lot. And it's actually quite an old-fashioned way of telling stories. If you remember that Dickens, for instance, used to do serial dramas in all of his big novels, and people would say to Dickens, why do you think they're so successful? And he would say, make them laugh, make them cry, make them wait. And the waiting, the holding off of the satisfaction for the audience is, I think, part of the reason for his success. So what we don't do is try and plastically create a big showdown for Christmas or Easter. We just we drag it out as long as we can.
Yeah, yeah. What do you think of the reaction, Louisa? Because it has been, I mean, this has been a lot. Money has been raised for domestic abuse. I mean, it's extraordinary.
Absolutely extraordinary. I mean, our listeners have been incredible. The Just Giving page, it's really, really special what's happening there. But the media coverage too has been extraordinary. You can never really anticipate how a story is going to land. And I think much as I knew that it was very powerful, it's gained its own momentum, I think, you know, and really showing how great the show is, and more importantly, how vital it is that we talk about this issue.
And do people confuse you and Helen? Do they?
Never.
No?
It's never happened to me yet.
I thought you said your little boy said that you tried to stab somebody the other day.
Yeah. He said he'd heard from someone. He said, is it true? Yeah.
Let me ask you this. Why do you think Rob is like he is? Sean, what is driving it? It doesn't appear to be sexual jealousy in this particular case, does it? But
I think it's quite simple. People keep asking what does he want to achieve? He wants to achieve control, and he's psychotic, is what I think. I think he's a plain old-fashioned
Why are people like that? I mean, we all have a little bit of that in us, don't we? I'm sure.
I think his mother's son, isn't he, and father's son.
I think it's a very complex issue, psychopathy. You know that there's a book called Snakes in Suits when psychopaths go to work, and they claim that the psychopaths aren't out there murdering people, they're actually running big companies or governments. So.
Don't give anything away. How does this go on? I mean, we've got a lot more to go. I mean, what's the?
Yeah, I mean, this is just the beginning. I mean, it's interesting that people think, oh, that's the climax, that's the end of the story. Actually, it's just the beginning, really.
Well, that's very enticing. And you've been 16 years in the Archers.
Yeah.
How long are you going to keep that going?
Oh, I hope to be as old as June Spencer.
How long is that?
She's 96.
She's 96.
She's 96?
She's been in the job since 1950, so there's a few years to go yet before you...
Yeah, a couple of years.
But you're allowed to do other things as well, aren't you? You can move
pretty
away.
much everyone does other work as well.
Well, look, well done on great plot line. Thanks both for coming in.
Thank you.
Well, that's just about all we have time for. Let's just take a quick look at the front pages. The Mirror, dominatrix Tory faces sleaze probe. So they're obviously going quite big on that. Faces investigation after he took his escort lover on a free trip to the MTV Awards in Amsterdam. The Telegraph, exactly as I said, believing it's a different scandal. BBC smeared Cabinet Minister is the Telegraph lead. The Guardian has moved straight off it. Benefit fraud or tax evasion, a row over the Tories' targets. Voters turn away from EU as trust in Cameron slides. That's the Times lead. And the Mail, new foreign aid outrage, again, not focusing on John Whittingdale at all. And the Independent, a generation left behind, UK's child poverty shame. That's it. As I say, I will be back here till tomorrow. We'll have a little bit of Jeremy Corbyn's speech to go on by then, I expect. But until then, have a very good night. Good night.
Good evening. Both England and Wales saw the highest temperatures of the